right, so it says we are alive. We're on. So, are you all alive?
We're alive.
All right, we're alive. Doesn't say we're alive, we're live. So, all right, it's good to see everybody. Glad y'all are here. I'm really glad y'all are here. I'll tell you what, this cold weather scared some folks off, didn't it? I might be talking to some of them out there on the cyber world on the other side of that screen. But it is good to see you. Hey, real quick, let me just mention something coming up in the next couple of weeks. Of course, next week, the 11th, we'll meet here on Wednesday evening, our regular meeting. But then on the 18th of December, don't forget, that's going to be our Christmas caroling evening. We're getting together and want everybody to join up with the Harris Life Group. They sponsor that and do a great job. It's a great experience if you've not done it before. We go around and see our shut-ins and so forth and go do some Christmas caroling, and it's always a blessing to them, but for those of us that participate, it really is. So keep that in mind. And then, so really next Wednesday will be the last Wednesday night we meet here in the Memorial Building until the first of the year, because we'll do the caroling on the 18th and we'll not meet on the Christmas and obviously on New Year's. So just keep that in mind. I'll give you another reminder next Wednesday evening. All right, so it's good to see you. Let's get our Bibles, if you would, and open them to 1 Samuel chapter number 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8. And while you're doing that, just kind of real quick, a review of where we have been in the book of 1 Samuel. Chapter 7, we finished up a week before Thanksgiving. And did y'all have a good Thanksgiving, by the way? You know, this time last week, we were getting ready for Thanksgiving, weren't we? And my family, we were getting ready for our traditional Thanksgiving dinner, but not a traditional American Thanksgiving dinner. We had Italian. My wife decided we were doing Olive Garden. So, but it was good. Hey, I had no complaints about it whatsoever. So it was a good time. So in chapter 7, keep in mind that we see where the ark made its way back to Israel, back to Kiriath Jearim, and it was taken care of there for quite some time. And then we get basically to the end of the chapter, and the primary point of chapter 7, which we were in 2 weeks ago, is that it really introduces us to the role of Samuel as judge. Up until that time, you know, we've seen him involved in his priestly ministry, his prophetic ministry. But remember that Samuel had a threefold ministry. He was prophet, priest, and judge. And so what we really get introduced to in chapter 7 is his role and his ministry as judge. In fact, the last part of chapter 7, in beginning in verse 15, says this: "And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life." Interesting that the primary part of his role, even though it was threefold, the primary part that's focused on is his role as judge. And also remember this, we pointed this out. In the book of Judges, if you remember, the judges that were raised up during that period of time, most of the time they served a military function. In other words, to lead Israel to go out into battle and to defeat their enemies that had oppressed them for 20, 30, 40 years, however long it might have been. And of course, God through that would, you know, have somewhat of there'd be a bit of a revival among the people. They'd get right with God to a certain degree, but then they wandered off again. But in Judges, the book of Judges, the judges there primarily served more of a military kind of role, okay? What we find with Samuel in chapter 7, and we see it even in the following chapters, his was more of a spiritually oriented judgeship. Because in chapter 7, we see where he leads Israel to a time of repentance, disavowing their idols, turning back to the Lord, and being renewed in their relationship with him. So just kind of keep that in mind. So, but it says he judged Israel all the days of his life. Verse 16 says he went from year to year on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and he judged Israel in those places. So he goes around on this circuit giving counsel more than anything else. So very different than what we saw in the book of Judges. But he always returned to Ramah, which was his home. His home was there. And there he judged Israel, and he built an altar to the Lord, which again underscores that worship and prayer was significant in the life of Samuel, more so than what we see even among many of those that are in the book of Judges. So he was really unique, although he is the last of the judges. And so certainly good that that ended on a good note. So that brings us to chapter number 8. And in your outline, you'll notice there's 4 main things we're going to cover this evening. And we start in verses 1 through 5, where here we see where Israel requests a king. And this really starts leading us into some newer experiences and things we'll get into in the book of Judges. But before we get there, what we want to do is look at beginning at verse 1, where Samuel, so now remember, here's Samuel, he's the judge. And even now we refer to him as the last of the judges. But he does something interesting that we read about here in chapter 8, verse 1. It says, "Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice." Now, when you think about those 2 sons of Samuel, who does that remind you of? Eli, you know? And we're going to make some commentary along those lines here in just a few moments. So here's the interesting thing. Samuel, as a whole, I mean, he's looked upon as being one of the most godly men in all of Scripture. And yet, his action here, questionable at best, may very well be a sin in that he appointed his sons to be judges. And obviously, there again, there's something reminiscent about Eli and his sons, because remember, Eli, one of the reasons why his sons were doing what they were doing, serving as priests, was because Eli was old. He couldn't hardly function and get around. And then, of course, his sons, they were worthless men, and sounds like Samuel's sons pretty well turned out that way. Just goes to show you, look, you know, Eli, on the one hand, was careless all through his sons' lives and raising of them. We're not necessarily given that, that's not necessarily told to us or anything implied with Samuel. You would think that he was much more diligent, but obviously his sons don't turn out so good. So you see very clearly, and we all know from experience, there's a lot of Christian parents who have try to raise their children and point them in the right direction, but you know what? They got a will of their own. Don?
There could have still been some residual influence from Eli's sons in the congregation that tempted them to fall into that order instead of being from Samuel's side. It could come from the other side of the fence.
And that's true, that there could have been continuing influences within the community and so forth. But it kind of raises this question with me, and I'll probably make this statement again, that he appoints his sons as judges knowing they're already ungodly men. That's the implication of the text. So that sort of like raises the question in my mind, is Samuel in his old age doing some of the things that Eli was guilty of? I mean, it's a lot of conjecture, we don't know, but obviously it raises questions, okay? But here's another thing. Here was another problem with Samuel taking the privilege, you might say, of appointing his sons as judges. No judge had ever been appointed by their father to inherit their role as a judge. God was the one that raised up the judges. And even though Samuel's a great man of God, you know, you have to be kind of careful. You know, in ministry or in anything, God blesses and uses us. Sometimes we can get to a point to where we become presumptive and take certain privileges that aren't ours. Okay? So that was an error on his part for sure. And so there again, you got to wonder, there's just some interesting reflection of what he would have seen and observed between Eli and his sons going on here in his old age. Verse 4 goes on and says this. So here's the point. So Samuel's old. he appoints his sons as judges. Verse 4 says this, then all the elders gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. Now, so when it talks about the elders of Israel, who are these elders? Where are they coming from? What do they represent? They represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So you've got from north to south, east to west, and the Transjordan as well, okay, on the east side. You've got these tribal leaders that are coming, and they came to Samuel's house. And they came for one express purpose. And that was to express their concerns about several things. Eli's getting old now, Samuel's getting old. Now they know what a great man Samuel has been up to that point. But then he's made this misguided appointment of his sons, and that troubles them because they can see that his sons are not the same kind of men that their father was at that time and had been up until that particular time. And so that becomes for them a bridge too far. So they're basically saying, you basically can't do it anymore. We don't want your scoundrel sons doing it. Now, in one sense, that indicates that Samuel has been effective in his ministry. Because when Eli was the priest in Shiloh, the standard was way, way low. Samuel has raised the bar. But then he comes in and he points his two sons, and the people now have come back and said, no, this is not going to stand. That's a bridge too far. We don't want that. So that leads them to say in verse number 5, and they said to him, look, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And so what has happened here is there's probably under the surface throughout Israel, there's this talk and this chatter going on. Everybody knows Samuel's getting older, and there's this talk about a king. Maybe we need a king. That has been tamped down until Samuel appoints his sons as judges. And now what was just below the surface has now risen to the top. And they come to him and said, we want you to appoint us a judge so that we can be like all nations. Now that leads us to the second thing, verses 6 through 8. God instructs Samuel concerning Israel's request for a king. So verse 6 says this, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. Now you can imagine there probably was some disappointment on Samuel's part that they're like, okay, I may be losing my influence because of my age. They don't like what I have done with my son. They've pretty much rejected that out of hand. That probably stung him a little bit. And so he comes along and they ask for a king, and so he goes and he prays. So here's one of the things I look at when I'm reading this text. What does he do when they come asking for a king? Well, he goes and he seeks the Lord, right? That's the right thing to do. Would you say, when I say that's the right thing to do? Here's what we're not told when he appointed his son judges. We're not told he inquired of the Lord. That's not a good thing, right? Because whatever we do, we ought to be inquiring of God and looking for his leadership in it. And so he goes and he goes to the Lord and he begins to pray. Verse number 7 says this. Now Israel, and here's the thing. Here was one of the concerns, because as he goes and prays, he's concerned about the fact they're asking for a king, right? Well, at least up until that time, what was God's plan for Israel? How was Israel supposed to be ruled? What kind of government was Israel supposed to be? A theocracy, which means what? That God is the king. So basically they come and they ask for a king. They don't need a king. God is their king. That's been the plan all along. Now, we're going to talk about here in just a little bit, Deuteronomy gives us some insight into the idea that God in his wisdom knew that at some point in time down the road, there probably would be a king in Israel, but he gives them some very specific guidance on that. We'll talk about that in just a few moments, okay? So verse number 7 says this, so Samuel goes and he prays the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. Now that gives us kind of a little bit of insight into what might have been going on with Samuel. They come along, we don't want your sons, you're getting too old, give us a king. Samuel might have been thinking, well, they're wanting to boot me, they're rejecting me. But God says to him, they didn't reject you, they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Verse number 8 says, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now therefore heed their voice, however you shall solemnly forewarn them. Let me stop right there for just a moment. So if you think about it, throughout all of Israel's history, they've had this constant thing about turning on God. And God in his mercy and grace reaches out, brings them back to himself. They get restored for a period of time. Then they just kind of go off on another tangent. Probably about the only time during which that was not the cycle was during the time of Joshua leading Israel when they were going into conquer the land, right? The conquest of the land. But even then, they didn't completely obey God, did they? They didn't completely remove the Canaanites from the land, did they? They made deals with them. So even under Joshua, they didn't do exactly as God had told them to do. So verse number 9 goes on and says this, however, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So God says to Samuel, you are to forewarn Israel. Now, what does it mean when you forewarn somebody? What are you doing when you forewarn somebody? You tell them, look, if you choose this path, I mean, for all of us that have got kids, how many times have we had conversations with them and said, if you go down this road, here's what's going to happen. Do they listen? Sometimes. Partly. And so Samuel's told to forewarn them, and of course he's doing that on behalf of God. And so here's what he's going to do. He's being told to forewarn them so that when they make their decision, number one, they're making an informed decision. They have been told up front, here's what is, here's what the potential hazards are if you go down that road, okay? But not only is he informing them so they make an informed choice, he's also saying to them that when all this comes to fruition, what you're being warned about, when it all comes to pass, you will not be able to say, we did not know. And they will be held fully accountable. Okay? Now, so there's a lesson here for us to learn in these verses. Because we said at the outset, I don't know if you remember this or not, but when we first started in 1 Samuel, and this applies to 1 and 2 Samuel, one of the things that you see in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel is you see God's sovereignty at work in many different kinds of ways. And this is one of those instances. So in many ways, what you have here is this request of theirs at this stage in Samuel's life and this stage in Israel's history, and with all that was going on, it's just some timing of some things coming together under God's sovereignty. Because God knew that Israel eventually was going to want a king. But here was the thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later in Deuteronomy, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. God knew that there would come a time that Israel would want a king. And that was not beyond the pale. But here was the problem. When it came time for Israel to have a king, God's will was that it be the king he chose for them. And it would be at his timing. Now, so here's what's going on here. Israel is not waiting on God's timing. Israel is not interested in the man that God wants to choose to be king over his people. They want their king, and they want it now. And guess what? They're going to end up with a king who becomes a bad king. Saul. We're going to be getting into that next week. We'll be getting into all that. And the thing about it is, they're going to get what they wanted, and it's going to be painful. They're going to hurt. Here's the lesson for us. There are times when God lets us have what we want, and we live to have buyer's remorse. And that's exactly what's going to happen to Israel, because this deal with Saul is not going to go well. Okay? Now, so we come to verses 10 through 18. And here is where God warns Israel. So here's going to be the forewarning that God is going to give to Israel through Samuel. They're going to be forewarned. So verse 10 begins and says this. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. Now listen to this very closely. He will take your sons and appoint them for his own chariots to be his own and to be his horsemen, and some will run before his chariots. He will appoint captains over thousands and captains over 50s, and will set some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage, and give it to his officers and servants. And he will take your male servants, your female servants, your finest young men, your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your sheep, and you will be his servants. So now here's the thing. From Israel's perspective, they're thinking to themselves, we've got problems, and we need a king to solve these problems. Now, there is some sense in which a king would help solve maybe some of their problems from their perspective, all right? But here's what God wanted them to know. While on the one hand, this king might solve some of your temporary problems, he's going to bring with him greater problems. In fact, did you notice this? Did you notice how many times he says he will take? Let me tell you how many times he says. Count them. He will take, 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 he will take. Did y'all count those? I didn't. 6 or 7, all right? And then he says, and you will be his servants. So God gave them fair warning through Samuel as he forewarns them. And if Israel wanted a king, here's what God was saying to them. If you want a king, and you want a king of your choosing, he's going to be a taker, and you're going to be his servants. Now, so look at verse number 18. So then notice this, and this is where it all really comes together. Watch this, verse 18. And you will cry out in that day because of whose king? And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen. See, that's the consequence of getting ahead of God. That's what I said a few minutes ago. There are times when God will say, okay, you want this? You want this on your terms? You want this in your timing and so forth? Go ahead. You can get it. We do it all the time. We get this idea, I've got to have this, I got to have that. God's blessed us, he's met needs, but that's not good enough. No, I got to have a newer one. I got to have a better one. I got to have a shinier one. I got to have a bigger one. I got to have one that's better than what my neighbor's got now. Go ahead and get it. But it's going to come back to bite you. In that day you'll cry out, because your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and notice this, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. In other words, you're just going to have to suffer the consequences that come from you choosing your king instead of letting me choose the king that I want.
We just did that.
Well, and we didn't have much of a choice.
The previous choice was more in line with this.
Yeah, this is true. And then that brings us to verses 19 to 22. Israel ignores God's warning concerning a king. Reminds me one time when I was a kid, me and my cousin, we were going to go fishing because we lived right there on the lake, and we were going to go fishing. And my dad always used open face fishing rod, and of course that's what I still to this day pretty much use when I go fishing. And so I asked my dad, I said, Dad, can I use your fishing pole to go fishing with Kenny? And Dad said, yeah, you can go, but you better make sure you bring my rod and reel back. Okay, Dad, no problem. We go fishing, then we get down there on the lake, and then we quit fishing, and we get to goofing off and lay the stuff down and decide it's time to go home. And I get back home, and I come walking up, and Dad's working on the car. That was never good. When Dad's working on the car, it was never good, all right? That was going to be a bad day. You know how that mechanic and stuff goes. And I walk up, and Dad says, he sees me coming in and says, where's my fishing pole? I said, Dad, I forgot it. He said, I told you, bring my fishing pole home. And I said, well, if you want it, go get it. You know, I'm young. Now, to me at that time, he was old. I'm faster than him. You know what I mean? No. Now, my dad, he was a welder, and so jeans, and always wore a big, heavy, thick leather belt. I'm telling you what's the truth. He had that belt off faster than I could even say giddy up. And I thought, well, surely I know I can outrun him. I didn't outrun him, and now he's got me going down the road. You know, it's like this. It was payday, all right? There weren't going to be no mercy on that day. God's saying, listen, there's not going to be any mercy. You asked for this, you're going to get it.
Did you ever get his phone?
Yes. Yes, I did. I went back and got it. So here Israel ignores God's warning that he's just given to them. So verse number 19 says this, nevertheless the people refused to obey. Now, it's interesting how the scriptures phrase that. It doesn't just say that the people didn't obey. It says they refused to obey. The voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but we will have a king over us. Now take that out of that context right there and think about how we sometimes act when we basically say to God, maybe not so much in those words, but in attitude and actions, where we say, no, but I will have whatever it is. Maybe something God has explicitly said in Scripture, you're not to touch it, not to have it. It may be something he's told us through prayer and through counsel. You don't need this, don't go there. See, we do the same thing. And that's one of the great things about when we go back and we study Scripture and we read these ancient stories, but we still find so much relevancy and we see a lot of us in them. And so they said, no, but we will have a king over us. Look at this. And here was the problem. There again, remember, it wasn't so much having a king. It was their motive and the kind of king they wanted and the fact that they wanted to be ones that chose the king and not God. So it says this, so that we may be like all the nations. I talk about my dad. I can remember many times I'd go in and say to Dad, Dad, can I do this, that? Can I have this, that, whatever? And he'd say, why? Well, everybody else is. Dad had two typical responses to that. If everybody else jumps off a cliff, you want to jump with them? If they want to hang themselves with a gold-plated rope, you want to hang yourself with one? That we may be like all the nations, and that our King may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Wait a minute. Go back to chapter 7. Isn't it amazing how short our memories are? Go back to chapter 7, because remember, after the ark is brought back to Israel, and there was a battle against the Midianites, and Israel was greatly outnumbered, God goes in and God defeats the Philistines for them. He just won victory over their enemy for them. And here they're saying, we want a king to go out and fight our battles. Verse 21. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. And so the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, that is, to the elders that had come to his house, every man go to his city. Now, what was the point of him sending all of them back to their city where they came from? They came with a request, right? They got the answer, right? What was the answer? You want a king? You're getting a king. Now, you go back to your city and do what? Let them know. God's going to give you the king you want. But let me tell you what I guarantee you they didn't tell them. I'll guarantee you what they didn't tell them was, God's going to let you have the king you want, but you're going to live to regret it. Guarantee you they didn't communicate that part. Now, I mentioned a minute ago, having a king over Israel was something that God had factored in at some point in time. Because if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, now remember something. So what is the book of Deuteronomy? Deuteronomy is Moses rehearsing the teachings of the law and the commandments of God for the new generation that has risen up, that's going to enter into the promised land, because the other generation that came out of Egypt died. That's why it's called Deuteronomy, the second law. There's the second teaching of this new generation. And so in Deuteronomy 17, here's what we read, beginning of verse 14. It says this, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it, and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. See, God's already factored in the fact that he knows that there's going to come a time where Israel wants a king, but what he was saying to them here is, you need to let me choose the king, not you. Then listen to this. It will be the one whom the Lord chooses, one from among your brethren, that you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall not, listen to this, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. But here's the problem. You say, wait a minute. Even under David and Solomon, those things happened, didn't they? Why? Because Israel set the mold for it from the beginning when they decided to choose their own king who did all those things, and he set the mold for it. Now, God raised David up in place of Saul, and David was the anointed and the man after God's own heart and all the things that we know about David, but the mold has already been set, that a lot of those things never ever ceased. When Solomon gets on the throne, does it get any better? No, it multiplied greatly. So that brings us to the threshold that we'll begin crossing next Wednesday evening, that leads to Saul becoming the first king over Israel, that is essentially the king that Israel chooses for themselves. All right, any questions, Don?
Verse 20 shows that they didn't listen to what Samuel told them that God said. God told them the king would take, and he would send their people. In verse 20 it says they want a king so he can go out before us and fight our battles. That isn't what God told them. He said, I want to take your sons to go out and fight the battles. So they didn't listen to what had been told them.
No, they heard what they want to hear,
Yeah.
which is typically very common with us. So,
Still thought too, that same verse, first half of that, how hurtful must be the Lord here in the second one. We want to be like everybody else. We don't want to be separate to you. Makes me wonder about, frankly, us today. We want to be separated to God. We won't be like everybody else.
yeah, it's true. And you know that when Israel rejected the Lord, I've been reading some material and it's about the filling of the Spirit and the work of the Spirit in our lives. And today I was just reading about the two things in the Scripture that says, do not grieve the Spirit and do not quench the Spirit. And the author that I was reading made a really good point. I never thought about this, where Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 4, and he says, grieve not the Spirit of God. And the author said, grieve is a love word. Grieve is a word that's related to love. In other words, what he's saying is this: who grieves us? What are the things that grieve us? It's when those that we love hurt us or are hurt. And so it's kind of that same thing that we have right here of rejecting the Lord. That it's all like saying grieving his heart. You know that has to. And you're right, Ron, what you're saying is we still struggle with this whole idea about understanding what it means to be separated to the Lord and to be what he wants us to be and not to want to be like everybody else. That's something that we still struggle with.
He calls us to choose your people. Scripture says, so that's to be set apart. Here they're saying they won't be like everybody else, so it's contrary to the thought process.
Yes, it is. All right, anyone else? All right, we will wrap it up there. Thank you for joining us online. Have a great evening. God bless. All right, we're